10 brutal money stats about the average person. You probably think you're doing okay financially. Not great, maybe, but okay. You're not living paycheck to paycheck. Well, not always. You've got some savings, not a lot, but some. You're contributing to retirement when you can afford to. You're basically keeping your head above water, which in this economy feels like an accomplishment. And compared to people who are really struggling, you're doing fine, right? But then you see statistics about the average American's financial situation, and there's this uncomfortable moment where you realize that average is actually kind of terrifying. That the baseline most people are operating from isn't fine. It's precarious at best and catastrophic at worst. And if you're honest with yourself, you're probably closer to that average than you'd like to admit. My name is Jack, and I spend way too much time analyzing financial statistics, studying what the data actually reveals about how most people handle money, and trying to understand the gap between how people think they're doing financially versus the brutal reality of their actual situation. And what I've discovered is that the statistics on the average person's financial life are genuinely shocking. Not in an abstract, that's too bad for those people way, but in a holy shit, that could be me way, that should make anyone paying attention immediately reassess their own financial decisions. Because here's what these statistics reveal. Most people are not okay. Most people are not fine. Most people are one or two bad breaks away from financial disaster, and they're so normalized to this precarious existence that they don't even recognize how dangerous their situation is. And understanding these numbers isn't about feeling superior or judging others. It's about seeing the financial traps that catch most people so you can deliberately avoid them yourself. So if you've ever wondered how you stack up financially against the average person, or if you want a reality check on whether your financial situation is actually as solid as you think it is, or if you need motivation to make different choices than most people make, this is for you. Because these 10 statistics are brutal, uncomfortable, and absolutely essential to understand. Stat 1. 64% can't cover a $1,000 emergency. Let's start with the most fundamental measure of financial stability. Can you handle an unexpected $1,000 expense without going into debt or selling something? According to recent surveys, roughly 64% of Americans cannot. Nearly two-thirds of the country would have to borrow money, put it on a credit card, or scramble to cover a basic emergency that costs $1,000. We're not talking about a medical crisis or a major disaster. We're talking about a car repair, a broken appliance, a modest dental procedure. This means that the majority of people are living so close to the financial edge that a completely normal, predictable type of expense becomes a crisis. And here's what's brutal about this stat. $1,000 emergencies aren't rare. They happen to everyone multiple times throughout life. If you can't handle them, you're going to spiral into debt repeatedly. I watch this play out constantly. Someone's car needs $1,200 in repairs. They don't have $1,200, so they put it on a credit card. Now they're paying 18% interest on that $1,200 while trying to pay it off, which takes months or years because they barely have margin in their budget. Meanwhile, another $1,000 emergency happens before they've paid off the first one, and they're deeper in debt. This stat reveals that most people have zero financial buffer. They're operating with no margin for error, which means they're one expense away from a debt spiral at all times. And they've normalized this level of financial fragility to the point where they don't even see it as a crisis. It's just how life is. The brutal truth, if you can't cover $1,000 without borrowing, you're not financially stable no matter what else is true about your situation. You're vulnerable, and that vulnerability compounds over time. Stat 2. The average savings account balance is $62,000. But the median is $8,000. Here's a stat that perfectly illustrates how misleading averages can be. The average American has about $62,000 in savings, which sounds pretty good. But the median is only $8,000, which tells a completely different story. What's happening here is that a small percentage of people with very high savings are pulling the average up dramatically, while the majority of people have almost nothing saved. Half of all Americans have less than $8,000 in total savings. Let that sink in. Not $8,000 in emergency fund with more elsewhere. $8,000 total across all savings accounts. And for younger people, it's even worse. The median savings for people under 35 is closer to $3,000 to $4,000. an amount that wouldn't even cover 2 months of basic expenses for most people. This means that half the country is perpetually one job loss, one medical issue, one major expense away from being completely broke. They have no cushion, no buffer, no runway to handle disruption. And they're living like this is normal, like this is just how financial life works. I know people in their 40s with $12,000 in total savings who think they're doing well because they have more saved than most people. And technically, they're right. They're above the median. But $12,000 isn't financial security. It's barely enough to survive a few months of unemployment. It's not a foundation for building wealth. The brutal truth, most people have saved so little that they have essentially no financial security whatsoever. And the few people with substantial savings are so far ahead that they're operating in a completely different financial reality. Stat 3. 45% have zero retirement savings. Here's one that should terrify anyone thinking about their future. Nearly half of all Americans have absolutely nothing saved for retirement. Zero. Not enough, not less than they should. Literally $0 set aside for when they can't or don't want to work anymore. And this isn't just young people who have time to catch up. A significant portion of people in their 50s and 60s have zero retirement savings. They're within a decade of retirement age with no plan, except hoping Social Security will be enough, which it won't be. The average Social Security benefit is around $1,900 per month. Try living on $1,900 a month in retirement. It's barely subsistence level in most parts of the country. And that's what nearly half the country is facing because they never invested in retirement accounts during their working years. The reasons vary. Some people genuinely couldn't afford to save because their income was too low. But many people could have saved something and chose not to, either because they didn't understand compound growth or because they prioritized current consumption over future security. And here's the really brutal part. The people with zero retirement savings are going to work longer than they want to, retire into poverty, or become financially dependent on family members who probably can't afford to support them either. Their failure to save creates a cascade of consequences that affects them and everyone around them. I know someone in their early 60s who's just now realizing they can't retire because they have maybe $40,000 saved total. They're going to work until they physically can't anymore, and even then they'll be struggling financially. And this could have been avoided if they'd invested even $300 a month throughout their career. The brutal truth, half the country is heading toward a retirement that will range from uncomfortable to desperate because they never prioritized saving during their working years. Stat 4. Average credit card debt is $6,500 per person. The average American carries about $6,500 in credit card debt, and for households that carry any balance at all, the average jumps to over $10,000. This is high-interest debt, typically at 18 to 24% APR, that's costing people thousands of dollars per year in interest alone. If you're carrying $10,000 at 20% interest and only making minimum payments, you're paying about $2,000 annually in interest just to maintain the debt. That's $2,000 every year that's completely wasted, buying nothing, building nothing, just enriching credit card companies. And here's what makes this stat particularly brutal. Credit card debt is usually the result of lifestyle inflation and consumption that people couldn't actually afford. It's not typically emergency medical debt or other truly unavoidable expenses. It's accumulated purchases over time that seemed affordable in the moment, but added up to unsustainable debt. The psychological mechanism is clear. People feel like they can afford something because they can afford the minimum payment, not recognizing that they're signing up for years of paying multiples of the original purchase price through interest. I've watched people accumulate credit card debt so gradually they barely noticed. A few dinners out here, some clothes there, a vacation put on credit, an emergency car repair, Christmas gifts they couldn't quite afford. Each individual charge seemed manageable. But 5 years later, they're carrying $12,000 in debt and wondering how it happened. The brutal truth, most people are voluntarily paying thousands of dollars per year in interest on consumption they couldn't afford, essentially making themselves poorer every single month while thinking they're just managing their finances. Stat 5, 54%. Live paycheck to paycheck. This one reveals the fundamental precariousness of most people's financial existence. More than half of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck, meaning they depend on each paycheck to cover basic expenses with essentially nothing left over. And this isn't just low-income workers. Studies show that a significant percentage of people making $100,000 plus also live paycheck to paycheck because their lifestyle expenses have inflated to consume their entire income. Living paycheck to paycheck means zero margin for error. A single missed paycheck becomes a crisis. A delayed payment from an employer creates cascading problems. There's no buffer between income and survival, and it creates this weird cognitive dissonance where people are making decent money but feel broke all the time because they are broke. Every dollar is already allocated before it arrives, and there's nothing left for building wealth or handling disruptions. The mechanism is always the same. Expenses rise to match or exceed income. People making $50,000 feel broke. They get a raise to $75,000 and feel temporarily better. Then lifestyle inflates, and they feel broke again. The income changes, but the paycheck-to-paycheck status doesn't, because spending always keeps pace. I see this pattern constantly. People who should be building wealth based on their income but can't because they've locked themselves into a lifestyle that consumes everything they make. They're on a treadmill, working to fund consumption that brings no lasting value or security. The brutal truth: most people have structured their financial lives so tightly that they can't survive even brief interruptions to income, which means they're perpetually vulnerable and can never build real wealth. Stat 6. Average net worth at age 35 is about $76,000. Here's a stat that reveals how far behind most people are in wealth building. The average net worth for Americans aged 35 is around $76,000. That might sound okay until you realize that includes home equity, retirement accounts, everything. And remember, that's average, not median. The median net worth for 35-year-olds is closer to $40,000. Half of people at 35 have less than $40,000 in total wealth after working full-time for 10 to 15 years. This means that by the time people are approaching middle age, most have accumulated almost nothing. They're entering what should be their peak wealth-building years with barely a foundation to build from. And if you're 35 with $40,000 net worth and you want to retire at 65 with $1 million, you need to save about $1,600 per month for the next 30 years. That's a dramatically higher savings rate than most people can achieve, which means most people starting from this position will never reach seven figures. The compound effect of starting late or starting with almost nothing is brutal. Every year you delay building wealth is exponentially more expensive than you realize because you lose not just the contributions, but all the compound growth those contributions would have generated. I know people in their late 30s with net worth under $50,000 who are finally realizing they're way behind but aren't sure how to catch up. The math is daunting, and the lifestyle changes required to save enough feel overwhelming, so many just don't. They accept that they'll work longer and retire with less. The brutal truth: by 35, most people are so far behind on wealth building that catching up requires a level of financial discipline and sacrifice they're unlikely to achieve. Stat 7. Only 32% could cover 6 months of expenses from savings. Financial advisors recommend having 3 to 6 months of expenses saved as an emergency fund, but only about 32% of Americans could actually cover 6 months of expenses from their savings. This means that 68% of people, more than two-thirds, could not survive 6 months without income. In a job loss scenario, most people would be in serious trouble within 60 to 90 days. And this stat is particularly relevant given how unstable employment can be. Layoffs happen, industries contract, companies fail. The idea that your job is secure and you'll never face extended unemployment is naive, yet most people are operating as if that's guaranteed. The psychological comfort of having 6 months of expenses saved is hard to overstate. It changes how you make career decisions, how you negotiate, how you handle workplace stress. You're not desperate, which means you have options. But most people don't have the security, which means they're constantly operating from a place of quiet desperation, even if they won't admit it. I reached 6 months of expenses saved in my early 30s, and it fundamentally changed how I approached work. I could take calculated risks, push back on unreasonable demands, consider career changes. My friends without that cushion couldn't. They were trapped by financial necessity into staying in jobs they hated because they had no runway. The brutal truth, most people are completely dependent on their next few paychecks for survival, which means they have no leverage, no options, and no real security, despite appearing financially functional. Stat 8. Student loan debt averages $37,000 per borrower. For the 43 million Americans with student loans, the average balance is about $37,000, with monthly payments typically ranging from $200 to $400. And this debt is crushing young people's ability to build wealth during their most important wealth-building years. Someone graduating at 22 with $37,000 in student debt at 5% interest is going to pay around $400 monthly for 10 years. That's $48,000 over a decade, $11,000 in interest on top of the original $37,000. Money that could have been invested, saved, or used for a down payment on a house. And the opportunity cost is even worse than the direct cost. That $400 monthly invested from age 22 to 32 at 8% returns would become about $73,000. But instead of building that wealth, borrowers are paying down debt, which means they emerge at 32 with zero instead of $73,000. The real cost of the student loan is more like $110,000 in wealth they failed to build. Student debt is delaying marriage, delaying homeownership, delaying childbearing, and destroying wealth building for an entire generation. And the cruel part is that many of these borrowers don't even have degrees that commanded higher income to offset the debt. I know people in their mid-30s still paying student loans from degrees they got 15 years ago. That debt has followed them through their entire adult life, preventing them from building the wealth they should have accumulated during their peak earning years. The brutal truth: student loan debt is a multi-decade anchor on millions of people's financial lives, and the interest and opportunity costs are far higher than most borrowers understand when they sign up for the loans. Stat 9. 69% don't have a written budget. Here's one that explains a lot of the other stats. Nearly 70% of Americans don't have a written budget. They have no clear understanding of where their money goes, no plan for spending and saving, no framework for making financial decisions. And you can't manage what you don't measure. Without a budget, people are just guessing about whether they can afford things, hoping money will somehow be left at the end of the month, and wondering why they can never get ahead financially. The lack of budget means spending tends to unconsciously expand to fill available income. There's no constraint, no target, no feedback loop that would highlight when you're overspending in certain categories. It's financial autopilot, which almost always leads to suboptimal outcomes. I've seen people genuinely surprised when they actually track spending for a month and discover they're spending $800 on food delivery and $300 on subscriptions they barely use. Without the budget, it was invisible. With the budget, it became obvious waste that could be redirected. And this stat also reveals something about financial education and priorities. People will spend hours researching which TV to buy but won't spend 30 minutes a month tracking and planning their spending. The priorities are completely inverted relative to what would actually improve their financial lives. The brutal truth: most people are operating financially blind, making decisions without data, and then wondering why they can't seem to build wealth despite making decent income. Stat 10. Average person will work until age 66, but wants to retire at 62. Here's the gap that reveals the consequences of all the other stats. The average American wants to retire at 62, but will actually work until 66, and many will work even longer because they won't have saved enough. The 4-year gap between desired retirement and realistic retirement might not sound huge, but it represents 4 more years of working when you thought you'd be done. 4 more years of alarm clocks and commutes and meetings when you imagined you'd be traveling or relaxing or pursuing hobbies. And for many people, the gap will be larger. If you've saved nothing for retirement, if you're living paycheck to paycheck in your 50s, if you're carrying debt into your 60s, you might work until 70 or beyond, not by choice, but by necessity. This is the brutal endgame of all the earlier statistics. The failure to save, the debt accumulation, the paycheck-to-paycheck existence, the lack of budget, they all culminate in working longer than you want to, retiring into financial stress, and never achieving the freedom you spent your career imagining. I watch people in their 50s and 60s realize this, and the regret is palpable. They wish they'd saved more, spent less, taken finances seriously earlier. But by the time they have that realization, the compound growth window has mostly closed. They can still improve their situation, but they can't get back the decades of compound interest they missed. The brutal truth: most people's financial choices throughout their working life are going to result in working longer than they want and retiring into a more constrained financial situation then. So from now, it's time to go from average to best. So that's it for this V.